The Mockery, the grand hall of the celestial empire, was alive with colors that shimmered like liquid fire across the walls. Towering pillars stretched upward as if holding the weight of stars themselves, and noble guests from dozens of worlds filled the chamber with their voices. It was a gathering meant to display the pride of the empire, and above all, the strength of the royal bloodlines that shaped its destiny. At the center, seated on a throne that seemed carved from light, the emperor raised his hand to silence the crowd, and into that hush the four princesses entered, each one radiant in her own way, each one carrying the confidence of being born into a line that ruled entire systems. They stepped forward one by one, their robes whispering against the polished floor. The first bore the mark of the firehouses, her hair glimmering like embers, her eyes burning with a gaze that seemed to judge and dismiss in the same moment. The second carried the elegance of the water clans, her movements fluid and graceful, her face serene yet edged with quiet cruelty. The third came from the houses of air, her presence sharp and quick as lightning, her voice carrying the mocking tone of someone who believed no one could ever match her. The last was of the stone lineages, her strength visible in her posture, her arms folded as though nothing in the universe could break her pride. Together, they were the future of the empire, and together, they stood in perfect unity when they turned their eyes upon the human visitor. Daniel stood at the edge of the hall, barely more than a symbolic presence, for Earth was not counted among the great powers of the galaxy. Humanity had only recently been granted the smallest seat in the assembly, a gesture that many considered charity rather than respect. He wore a simple envoy's robe, nothing compared to the flowing garments of the nobles, and he carried himself with the quiet composure of someone who knew he was out of place, yet refused to shrink before the stares. Around him whispers moved like shadows, questions of why a human had been invited at all, laughter at the thought that his species might matter in such a hall. The first princess was the one who spoke, her words loud enough for all to hear, her tone sharp as flame. She said that it amused her to see a fragile creature from Earth standing among them, a being whose lifespan was a flicker compared to theirs, whose bones broke easily, and whose world had no great fleets to defend it. The nobles laughed, their jeweled crowns shaking with the sound, and the hall rang with mockery. The second princess raised her hand as though to quiet the laughter, but her voice was no gentler. She compared humanity to rivers that dried too soon, to tides that came and went without leaving any true mark on the shore. She said it was sweet that Earth sent an envoy, but no one here should mistake that gesture for strength. The third princess, whose tongue was always quick, tilted her head and asked if Daniel had come to learn how real civilization survived, for surely his people had no stories worth telling. She described humans as children stumbling in the dark of the galaxy, daring to step into the light only to be blinded by it. The last princess, her voice heavy as stone, said that she could crush 10 humans in her grip, and if the empire ever needed proof of their weakness, she would gladly demonstrate. The laughter rose again, and the hall seemed to glow with the cruel joy of nobles who thought themselves secure above all others. Yet Daniel did not bow his head, nor did he answer with anger. He stood still, his gaze calm, his hands resting lightly at his sides, and though his heart beat fast, his face betrayed no fear. To him, their words were sharp, but he had grown up in a world where words alone never defined truth. He thought of Earth, a small blue world that had survived storms, wars, famine, and yet endured. He thought of his ancestors who had crossed oceans in fragile ships, of those who had walked deserts and mountains, of those who had looked at the stars and dared to believe they could reach them. He carried all of that in his silence, and though he said nothing, there was a weight in his stillness that did not escape every eye. The emperor, who had watched without expression, raised his staff, and the hall quieted once more. His voice, deep and commanding, declared that the empire had long awaited the fulfillment of an ancient tradition, one that would test the heirs of the royal houses and decide who among them could inherit the combined legacies of the four lines. This was not merely ceremony but prophecy, for it was said that only one of true worth could hold the power of fire, water, air, and stone together. Murmurs swept the hall, for this tradition had not been called upon in generations, and many wondered why the emperor had chosen this day. Then his gaze fell upon Daniel, and the hall seemed to freeze. With a voice that carried across the chamber, the emperor declared that the test would not be limited to blood alone. For the first time in history, one not of the royal houses would stand as challenger, so that all might see whether worth was truly born of lineage or of spirit. The words struck the nobles like thunder. Protests rose at once, voices demanding that no outsider be allowed to stand against the princesses. But the emperor silenced them with a look that burned fiercer than any fire. His word was law, and none could undo it. The four princesses turned to face Daniel again, their mocking now sharpened by anger. To them it was an insult that a human would even be named in such a matter, an insult that touched their pride as daughters of the empire. They laughed again, but their laughter had an edge, for even they knew the emperor's will could not be denied. Daniel stepped forward, and though his legs trembled inside, his steps were steady. He had not asked for this, but something in the emperor's eyes told him there was purpose here, a purpose larger than his fear. The hall waited, nobles watching, princesses sneering, the emperor silent, and in that charged stillness, the fate of a human and the destiny of an empire began to weave together. The trials begin. The announcement of the trials spread across the grand hall like a wave of lightning through a storm. Nobles whispered to one another, some in disbelief, others in outrage, and still others with cruel amusement at what they believed would be a spectacle of failure. The four princesses stood tall, their faces glowing with a mixture of pride and contempt, for in their minds the result of the first trial was already decided. They knew that strength and endurance would be demanded, and in such contests, no fragile human could hope to stand against them. Their ancestors had lifted mountains, shaped rivers, and conquered worlds. What could a man from Earth possibly do but fall at their feet? The emperor gave no more speeches. With a gesture of his staff, the chamber shifted, walls folding back and light spilling downward as the hall transformed into an arena that had been hidden beneath the floor. The spectators gathered along high terraces, looking down upon a vast circle of stone etched with glowing runes. At its center, heavy gates opened and beasts bred for testing warriors emerged, their forms massive and threatening, their roars echoing so loud that the ground seemed to shake. The first trial had always been designed to measure not only the strength of flesh but the will to endure fear, pain, and exhaustion until all others had given way. The four princesses entered with confidence, each one bearing the crest of her lineage. The fire princess carried weapons that blazed with heat, her eyes alive with the thrill of combat. The water princess moved with flowing grace, her form almost dancing as if the arena were her private stage. The air princess stepped lightly, her every movement quick as though the wind itself obeyed her. The stone princess stood like an immovable wall, her muscles taut, her presence heavy with strength. Then came Daniel, and a ripple of laughter spread through the terraces. He had no weapon in his hands, no armor covering his body, only the plain envoy robe he had been given when he first entered the palace. To the nobles, it seemed that his presence was nothing more than a cruel joke. Arranged by fate, the emperor raised his staff once again, and the first trial began. The beasts charged forward, their eyes glowing, their massive jaws opening with roars that shook the arena. The princesses moved instantly, each one striking with the gifts of her house. Fire flashed across the stone floor, water surged in streams that cut like blades, wind screamed and lifted, stone cracked beneath pounding fists. Daniel, by contrast, did not strike. He moved aside, ducking low, rolling away from claws and teeth, his body quick, though not as powerful. The crowd jeered, shouting that he was running like prey, that this was proof of his weakness. Yet as the moments passed, something subtle began to change. The princesses attacked with fury, but their strength demanded much from them. Flames burned, bright but consumed energy quickly. Water surged but drained the body. Air and stone clashed with power but left muscles aching. Daniel, meanwhile, moved with care, never wasting more effort than was needed, his breath steady, his eyes sharp. He was struck more than once, his skin cut and his shoulder bruised, but each time he rose again, refusing to stay down. The beasts chased him, cornered him, knocked him to ground, but always he found a way to rise and keep moving. The Fire Princess shouted at him across the arena, mocking his retreat, calling him coward, but Daniel did not answer. He remembered stories of Earth, of how his ancestors had hunted prey not with speed or claws, but with persistence, chasing until stronger creatures fell from exhaustion. He remembered how his people had survived deserts and frozen lands, not because they were the strongest, but because they refused to stop walking when all others would collapse. Humanity's gift was not strength, but endurance, the quiet, stubborn refusal to surrender no matter the pain. The trial stretched longer than any had expected. One by one, the beasts began to falter, their massive bodies slowing, their roars weakening, until at last they lay still upon the stone floor. The princesses stood triumphant, yet their chests heaved with exhaustion. Sweat glistened upon their brows, and their limbs trembled slightly from the force they had spent. Daniel too stood, his robe torn, blood upon his skin, yet his breathing remained steady. His body had been punished, but his eyes still held the same calm fire that had carried him into the arena. The spectators stared in silence, for though he had not dazzled with strength or overwhelmed with power, Daniel had remained standing when all believed he would have fallen first. The youngest nobles whispered to one another that perhaps there was something strange about humans, some hidden strength that did not show in their muscles but lived in their spirit. The princesses heard those whispers, and it unsettled them, though they masked their unease with renewed laughter. They declared that endurance meant nothing without victory, that surviving was not the same as conquering, and that the next trial would crush whatever illusion of strength Daniel had shown. The emperor did not smile, but a faint glimmer of approval flickered in his eyes as he looked upon the bloodied human who still stood tall. He raised his staff again and announced that the first trial was complete. Those who remained standing had proven their bodies, but the second trial would test their minds, for strength of flesh could be broken, yet strength of thought shaped empires. The nobles cheered, confident once more that the human would finally be exposed, for surely no outsider could master the ancient knowledge of the royal lines. The arena shifted again, stone walls rising high, patterns of light weaving into towering pillars filled with symbols that glowed and shifted. These were riddles carved from history, puzzles of logic that stretched back to the founding of the empire, challenges designed to confuse and overwhelm even the brightest heirs. The princesses straightened their posture, pride returning to their faces, for they had been raised upon these lessons since childhood. They had memorized the stories, the codes, the secrets of their bloodlines. Daniel, by contrast, had no such training. He stepped into the maze of light with only the knowledge he carried from Earth, and the nobles smiled coldly, already imagining his humiliation. Yet Daniel did not look afraid. He placed his hand upon one of the glowing symbols, studied its shape, and began to think not as the princesses thought, but as a human. Where they sought answers in memory, he sought patterns. Where they reached for tradition, he reached for creativity. The whispers in the terraces grew louder, for though no one yet understood how, there was something in his calm manner that made them pause. The second trial had begun, and with it came a silence thick with expectation. The human mined the pillars, of light rose around the arena like towering trees of fire, their surfaces covered in symbols that shifted and twisted as if alive, each glowing mark carrying the weight of ancient wisdom and forgotten prophecy. The nobles leaned forward in silence, their faces a mixture of pride and curiosity, for the second trial was not one of battle or endurance but of intellect, and in this contest the heirs of the empire were expected to shine brighter than any star. The four princesses stepped into the maze of glowing walls with the confidence of those who had studied since birth, their eyes darting across the changing patterns with ease, their minds sharp with memory of countless lessons. Each one believed that here they would prove their superiority without question, for what chance could a human envoy possibly have when faced with riddles written long before his kind had ever left their small world? Daniel followed quietly, his footsteps soft against the stone floor, his eyes moving slowly across the living symbols. He had not been trained in the histories of the Celestial Empire, nor had he been taught the hidden codes of its bloodlines, but as the symbols shifted, he did not panic. He studied them not as alien marks but as patterns, lines, shapes, and rhythms that reminded him of the puzzles his people had solved since the earliest days of survival. To him, they were like the stars in the night sky back on Earth, points of light that seemed random until one looked long enough to see the constellations that told stories. The first puzzle appeared as a wall of fire symbols that rearranged themselves into a riddle spoken aloud by the arena itself. The Fire Princess smiled and answered quickly, her words flowing with rehearsed certainty. The wall split apart, allowing her through, and the crowd cheered. The Water Princess followed with a puzzle of flowing symbols, her answer soft and melodic, and the maze opened for her as though in respect. The Air Princess laughed as her challenge appeared, for it was a question of speed and wit, and she answered before the echo of the riddle had even faded. The Stone Princess took longer, for her challenge was one of patience, but with a voice steady as rock, she gave the correct answer and passed through. Then came Daniel's turn. His wall of symbols shifted into a riddle spoken in a language older than his own tongue, its words twisting like vines, its meaning hidden in layers of tradition he could not possibly know. The nobles leaned forward, waiting for his silence, waiting for him to stumble and show his ignorance. The princesses smirked, certain that the trial would end for him here. Daniel listened, and though the words were foreign, he felt the rhythm beneath them, the structure of the riddle itself. It spoke of cycles, of endings and beginnings, of flames that die and rise again. He thought of Earth, of how fire burned the forest but left behind the ash that fed new growth, of how the sun rose each morning after sinking into the night. When the riddle demanded its answer, Daniel did not speak of empires or bloodlines as the princesses might have. Instead, he lifted his head and said softly that the answer was not power or conquest but renewal, the promise that life begins again after every end. The wall of symbols shimmered, paused as though considering, then broke apart to let him pass. The silence in the terraces was deeper than before, and when the nobles finally spoke, their voices carried disbelief. How could a human, untrained in their traditions, see an answer that even some of their own heirs might not have found so quickly? The Fire Princess clenched her jaw, her pride stung, but the trial pressed on. The next puzzles were harder, forcing each challenger to think not only of memory but of creativity. The Water Princess faced a puzzle that asked her to explain the shape of rivers that cut across worlds. She answered with precision, describing how her people shaped the flow of water to feed their cities. Daniel, when faced with a puzzle of moving streams of light that demanded balance, remembered the rivers of Earth, how they carved valleys, how they found paths around stone, how they taught his people patience. He answered not with numbers or maps, but with the truth that water was strength because it yielded, and the symbols opened for him once more. The Air Princess was given a puzzle of winds that twisted into illusions, and she solved it with speed. laughing as she went. Yet when Daniel's turn came, he was faced with a storm of symbols that asked how one could find direction when the winds never ceased. He thought of sailors on Earth, those who had crossed oceans guided not by calm seas, but by stars that never moved. And he spoke of constellations, of how his people found their way, even when tossed by storms. The symbols accepted his answer. And again the hall was filled with silence, for no one had expected a human to speak with such clarity. The stone princess faced a puzzle that demanded endurance of thought, a riddle that seemed never to end, and she stood like a mountain, repeating the answer until the wall relented. Daniel's puzzle, however, was a question of sacrifice, asking what one must give when strength alone is not enough. He closed his eyes, thinking of his people's history, of how countless generations had given their lives so that the next might walk further, of how parents gave for children, soldiers for peace, dreamers for discovery. He answered that the price was always part of the gift, that sacrifice was not weakness, but the foundation of all progress. The wall trembled, then opened, and the nobles could no longer deny the truth of his success. By the end of the trial, all five stood beyond the maze, but the atmosphere in the hall had shifted. The princesses had entered certain of their superiority. Yet again the human had stood beside them, not through the power of memorized lessons, but through perspective. None of them had considered. Their faces betrayed their unease, though they hid it behind scornful smiles. The nobles whispered more loudly now, some muttering that perhaps there was danger in allowing this test to continue, others whispering that perhaps the empire had underestimated what humans carried within them. The emperor remained silent, his face unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Daniel for longer than before. When he raised his staff, the hall quieted, and he declared that the second trial was complete. The heirs and the human had proven their minds, but the next challenge would pierce deeper than either body or intellect. The third trial, he said, would be one of heart, where the truth of one's spirit would be revealed, and where no mask of pride could hide the choices that defined worth. The nobles stirred with unease, for they knew that the trial of heart was often cruel, forcing challengers to face choices that stripped away all pretense. The princesses stood tall, though a shadow of doubt flickered in their eyes, for they were trained to conquer, not to give. Daniel, though bruised and weary, looked calm, for he remembered the strength of his people was not only in survival or cleverness, but in the strange, stubborn compassion that had carried them through countless ages. The hall held its breath, knowing that the next trial would not only test them, but reveal them. And in that silence the third chapter of destiny began to unfold. The test of heart. The air inside the grand hall grew heavy as the emperor's staff struck the floor, and the walls of the arena shifted again, stone sliding against stone until the glowing maze of riddles was gone, and in its place rose a circle of dark pillars that seemed to breathe with a strange living presence. Between them flickered veils of light like trembling curtains, and behind those veils shadows of figures could be seen, figures of men, women, and children, their faces pale with fear, their hands pressed against the barriers as though calling for help. The nobles watched in silence, for they all knew what this trial was, and though few had ever witnessed it with their own eyes, the stories told of choices so cruel that even the strongest heirs had faltered. The emperor's voice carried across the chamber with a calm that made the moment even heavier. He declared that this trial was not of strength or mind, but of heart, for the one who sought to inherit the legacies of the four lines must prove that they could place others above themselves, that they could bear pain when given the power to walk away, and that their spirit was not chained only to pride. The four princesses looked at the veils with cold determination. They were raised to lead, not to serve, and while compassion was not foreign to them, it was never what defined their people. The fire princess whispered that sacrifice was weakness. The water princess muttered that mercy drowned empires. The air princess smirked that hearts broke too easily. And the stone princess clenched her fists as though daring the trial to test her resolve. They believed that if cruelty was demanded, they could give it, and if indifference was demanded, they could wear it like armor. Daniel, standing beside them, felt his chest tighten as he saw the faces in the light, the illusions so real that their cries seemed to echo in his ears. He did not know whether they were real or not, but it did not matter, for their fear was as real as any he had seen in the eyes of children on his own world. The trial began without warning. The veils of light shifted, and from one of them stepped a figure, a trembling child with wide eyes who looked straight at the fire princess and begged for help. The challenge was simple yet cruel, for to step forward and take the child's place meant pain and punishment that would break flesh and spirit. But to walk away was to watch the figure suffer until nothing remained. The fire princess stood still, her jaw tight, her pride warring against the test. Slowly she stepped back, refusing to take the child's place, her voice sharp as she said that illusions deserved no sacrifice. The figure cried out, dissolved into light, and the nobles shifted uncomfortably, though none spoke. The water princess was tested next, a woman behind the veil pleading for her life, her hands bleeding as she pressed against the glowing wall. The princess narrowed her eyes, whispering to herself that mercy was weakness, that rulers must choose the empire over the individual. She turned away, and the figure faded into nothingness. The air princess faced an old man, his voice weak, his body frail, and though for a moment her smirk faltered, she too walked away, telling herself that the weak had no place in survival. The stone princess faced a mother cradling her child, and though her eyes flickered with unease, she hardened her heart, declaring that strength meant never yielding to illusions. One by one, the princesses turned their backs, and the hall grew colder with every choice they made. Then came Daniel's turn. The veil in front of him shifted, and from it stepped a figure that made his heart freeze. It was a young girl, no older than 10, her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she begged him not to let the pain take her. The emperor's voice rang again, declaring that to save her, he must take her place, and the pain of the trial would become his to bear. The nobles leaned forward, waiting for the human to falter, for surely no one would choose suffering for a stranger, not when survival was at stake. The princesses watched with cruel smiles, convinced that now his mask of calm would break. Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. He placed his hand on the veil, and at once the light consumed him, pulling him inside. The girl vanished, safe, and Daniel fell to his knees as searing pain tore through his body, pain unlike any wound of flesh, pain that burned through every nerve as though fire and stone and storm and flood raged inside him. His breath caught in his throat, his vision blurred, but he clenched his teeth and refused to cry out. The nobles gasped, for they had expected hesitation, bargaining, or retreat, but instead they saw a human choose sacrifice as if it were instinct. The princesses' smiles faltered, and for the first time doubt crossed their proud faces. The trial did not end there. Again the veil shifted, again figures appeared, and again Daniel was given the choice. A wounded soldier begging for release, a mother calling for her child, an elder praying not to die forgotten. Each time he stepped forward, each time he bore the pain himself, and each time his body broke a little more under the weight of suffering. His knees bled against the stone, his hands shook, his voice faltered, but still he chose to stand in place of others. The nobles could not look away, for in their world power had always been measured by how much one could take from others. Yet here stood a human showing power in how much he could give. By the end, Daniel lay upon the arena floor, his robe torn, his body trembling, his skin pale from exhaustion. The veils vanished, the pillars sank into the ground, and silence gripped the hall. The princesses stood untouched, their pride intact but their hearts shaken, for though they had passed by refusing to bend, it was the human who had revealed something deeper than victory. The emperor's eyes lingered on Daniel, and for the first time his stern face softened, as though he saw in the envoy not only a challenger, but a truth the empire had long forgotten. The nobles erupted in protest, their voices rising with anger and fear, demanding that the trial be declared void, that no outsider be allowed to inherit the legacies of the four lines. They shouted that the human was a danger, that his example would weaken the empire, that compassion had no place in rule. Yet their protests rang hollow, for in their hearts they knew what they had witnessed. Even the youngest princess, the one of air, turned her eyes away, unable to hide the unease growing inside her. The emperor lifted his staff and silence returned. His voice was calm, but its weight pressed upon every ear. He declared that the third trial was complete, that the human had endured pain beyond measure for the sake of others, and that in doing so he had revealed a spirit that could not be ignored. But the trials were not yet over. One final challenge remained, a trial not of body, mind, or even heart, but of destiny itself, where the truth of prophecy would decide who was worthy to inherit the legacies of all four lines. The nobles grew. Restless, the princesses stood in tense silence, and Daniel, though barely able to rise, lifted his head and met the emperor's gaze with steady eyes. The hall seemed to hold its breath, for the next step would decide not only the fate of a human envoy but the future of the celestial empire itself. Inheriting all four, the grand chamber of the celestial palace trembled with whispers as the announcement of the last trial spread across every corner and balcony. The nobles who had once laughed at the human envoy now leaned forward in disbelief, while the four princesses who once mocked him sat silent with faces no longer filled with ridicule, but with unease and confusion, because deep inside they already felt that the man they had dismissed might truly reach the end and change their future forever. The emperor rose from his high seat, dressed in robes that shimmered with threads of light. Taken from the stars themselves, his voice carried weight not from power alone, but from the thousands of years of law and prophecy that bound this empire. Together, he spoke slowly, telling the crowd that the final test was not one of strength or endurance, nor was it of knowledge or sacrifice, for the last trial was destiny itself. And destiny could not be measured by blades or books. It was revealed only when tradition met truth. Daniel stood there, still bruised from the previous ordeal, his skin pale, his breathing heavy, yet his eyes carried the same fire that had never faded since he entered the first trial. He was not a warrior by nature and not a scholar by training. He was simply human, one who refused to bend before arrogance and cruelty, one who endured because to him giving up was never an option. The hall filled with silence as the emperor gestured to the great altar at the center of the chamber, where four radiant crowns floated, suspended above the air, each glowing with a color representing the four houses of the princesses, one blue as the deep seas, one green as the endless forests, one gold as the burning suns, and one silver as the silent moon. The emperor declared that these crowns represented unity of the empire, and only the one who matched the prophecy could touch them, for legend told of a figure from outside the noble bloodlines who would carry endurance beyond warriors, knowledge beyond scholars, compassion beyond kings, and a vision that bound all differences together. That figure would inherit all four houses, not through conquest, but through spirit, and only then would the empire enter a new age. The crowd rumbled with outrage. Many nobles shouted that this was a trick. A human could never fulfill prophecy, yet others who had witnessed Daniel's choices remained silent and thoughtful. The princesses looked at each other with unease. Their mocking words now felt like chains that bound them, for they had claimed humans were weak, but this man had shown more strength in spirit than any champion their people had sent. Daniel stepped forward, his body trembling, his mind replaying every moment of the trials, the jeers, the pain, the doubt, but also the strange clarity that had guided him every time when the warriors laughed. He endured when the scholars mocked. He created new answers when the judges tested his heart. He chose compassion without hesitation, and now he stood at the last threshold, unsure of what destiny even meant for a simple man from Earth, but certain that if he had come this far, he could not stop now. He walked toward the floating crowns. The chamber grew so silent that the sound of his footsteps echoed like thunder one by one. He raised his hands first toward the blue crown, and the energy of the seas swirled around him. Instead of rejecting him, it wrapped around his body, like water embracing a long-lost traveler. Then he touched the green crown, and the spirit of life and forest responded, bending not to royal blood, but to his will to nurture and protect. Then he reached for the golden crown, and fire roared around him, threatening to burn, but it bent instead to the endurance that had carried him across every obstacle. Finally his hands rose toward the silver crown that shimmered with light of the silent moons. Everyone held their breath, expecting rejection, yet the crown descended gently, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The 4 crowns circled around Daniel, then merged into a single radiant crown above his head. The light spread across the entire chamber, flooding every corner with brilliance so powerful that nobles shielded their eyes. The prophecy was fulfilled, and the emperor himself bowed his head, for he knew the ancient laws were older than his reign, older even than the throne, and no one could deny what destiny had chosen. 4 princesses who once mocked him lowered their gaze, shame and awe filling their hearts. They realized that in their pride, they had failed to see what this human carried inside, a spirit stronger than blades, wiser than books, and kinder than crowns. Each of them stepped forward not by force, but by acceptance, bowing their heads in front of Daniel, for tradition now bound them to him. Yet more than tradition, it was respect that silenced their voices. Daniel stood not as a conqueror, but as a servant of truth. He did not gloat, he did not boast. Instead, he spoke with steady voice, saying that humanity's strength was never about power or empire or wealth. Humanity's gift was to endure, to imagine, to sacrifice, and to unite what was divided. He told them that he would not rule over them as a master, but walk with them as an equal, because if destiny brought him here, it was not to sit on a throne, but to remind the stars of what true strength meant. The chamber broke into chaos. Some nobles still refused to accept the human. Others bowed willingly, yet none could erase the light that crowned him, for it was not illusion, it was prophecy fulfilled, and history rewritten. The emperor lifted his staff, and declared before all that from this day, the legacy of the 4 houses belonged also to humanity, and that the mocking of men must end, for the stars themselves had chosen differently. The story of that moment spread across the empire to distant worlds where humans were seen as weak. Suddenly they were spoken of with awe and respect. The 4 princesses who once ridiculed Daniel became the first to defend him, for in seeing his heart they found what their own people had long forgotten: compassion, endurance, imagination, unity, qualities no throne could teach, but every human carried in silence. As Daniel looked at the sea of faces once filled with laughter at his expense, now filled with wonder, he felt no anger, only calm, for in their mockery they had overlooked the truth, and in that mistake they had crowned him their new heir, and the new chapter of both humanity and the empire had begun. The end.